On the build show today, we're talking ground level decks. We're at my house under construction, and I built this deck actually just for code and inspection purposes. I'm going for my final inspections, and you can't have a doorway that you're gonna fall out that's unsafe. So this ground level deck was the perfect opportunity for me to meet code, but also give you 3 tips for a ground level deck. Today's video is sponsored by Polywall. Let's get going. Okay guys, first let me define what we're talking about today. Ground level decks, meaning a deck that's less than 4 feet off the ground. Any deck that's fairly low to the ground, that's not elevated up in the air. These tips are specifically talking about that. And at my house under construction, you can see my back slab on grade door here is only about 18 inches above grade, which is nice because now I don't have to build a handrail or a guardrail, anything like that. But first off, let's jump into my first tip, and we're actually going to be talking about this product. This is the sponsor for the video, Polywall. This is a great Texas company. They make lots of different waterproofing products, but this is a tape that's specifically intended to protect your joists. We haven't screwed these 2 deck boards down yet, so let me show you what we've got here. When you look at a standard deck and you've got those joists on 16 or 24 inch on centers, these deck boards are gonna last a long, long time. This happens to be Kebony from Delta Millworks. But underneath those is a little more vulnerable. That's pressure treated lumber. It's usually pine. And that lumber can be vulnerable to decay. And one place in particular that I've seen a lot of decay over the years is where you screw into that board, you create an area where water can get in and can actually get past that pressure treating and cause rot and decay. And so oftentimes I see decks where the top boards are just fine, but the structure itself has rotted after just a couple of years. This joist tape that goes on over top of your joist protects the top of that. So now when I screw in there, that screw is kind of having some self-healing properties over that joist tape. And also, just as importantly, in between boards is a great spot for leaves and for water to sit and rot out those joists over time. By having that tape on there, we're protecting that joist, we're keeping that joist dry. Okay, tip number 2, speaking of joists, anytime you've got a ground level deck, a deck that's close to the ground, you need to think about what level of pressure treating you're using. And this is especially true for a deck like this that's less than 2 feet from the ground. I'm a big fan of going to a higher level of pressure treating. Now this happens to be ground contact wood that I used both for the joists and for my 4x4 posts. This is important and it's often overlooked because if this deck is as close as 6 inches off the ground, believe it or not, by code, you need to use ground contact because if you look at the codes, or pardon me, if you look at the literature, the data on what they constitute ground contact is anything 6 inches close to the ground or closer. So by using that heavier level of pressure treating compared to above grade pressure treating, it's gonna give those joists a much longer life. And that leads me to the second part of this tip, which is whenever you cut your lumber, you'll often see on the cut end of a 4x4, let's say on this post, that when you cut it, that treatment, that greenish kind of treatment that keeps the insects and the rot at bay, it doesn't absorb all the way to the core. And on this deck, you can see we only had to cut, 16-inch posts, let's say. So in order to make maximum use of my material, I had lots of places where I needed to do some end treatment. Now the best thing to do is buy an end cut solution. You can find that online. Here there will be a link in the description for this one that happens to be Copper Care that I got off Amazon, but you can find this a variety of places. And the way I like to do it is I like to pour it into a tub. I'll put the cut end down that I'm going to be using and I'll let it soak for a couple hours. You can see this end that was cut, that solution soaked up several inches into the wood, just like a tree sucking the water from the roots all the way up to the canopy. And that's really good. It means now that 4x4 is going to be protected for a much longer time. Okay, and third and final tip, I just found this product and I really like it. This is called a TuffBlock. This is from buildtuff.com. I think you can find these locally as well, but I happen to order these online. And check it out, it's a really tough deck footing product that's intended to spread that load over a greater area. And I like that you can fit a 4x4 right down in here like we did. Or if you had a lower deck, let's say a ground level deck, or actually I'm gonna be building a shed with this as my base, I can put my joists right on top here. This is meant to take 1.5 inch wide material right here. We can sit them down and then we can build on top of that. These will never rot. They're actually from recycled bottles, so they've got a kind of a nice green story to them. And the other thing I like about them is they've got some nipples on top here made out of that same plastic material. So when you sit something down on there, they're actually gonna be held up a little bit from the base, and it's not gonna have a tendency to rot. Very cool product, very reasonable in price. And it saved me, especially down here in Texas where I don't have a frost protection issue, or I don't have a freeze thaw cycle, I should say, from having to put concrete bases in here. And then someday if I want to rip this deck out and use it on another job to meet inspections, super easy to do. I don't have footings to remove, I don't have anything. I'll just pick this deck up and 2 or 3 people could move this over in a trailer and move it over to the next job. Same goes if I was building a shed and wanted to roll that shed off. I could just do it Egyptian style and put some 3-inch PVC pipe underneath it and roll these right off, put it back on these pads somewhere else on the property. Guys, hopefully you learned something. If you've got a ground level deck project coming up, use these 3 tips. This is really gonna give you the best longevity. I do wanna say thanks to my friends at Delta Millworks that provided the Kebony wood that I used on this project as well. Kebony is a very interesting product that looks a lot like Ipe, but has a much, much better environmental story. This is a radiata pine that's been treated with a bio-based treatment, solid all the way through. So when you cut it, it's brown all the way through, but it grays out in time and then there's really no maintenance. And that's what I'm gonna be doing on this deck. I'm just gonna let it go gray and not touch it. You can find that pretty much anywhere in the nation, but Delta Millworks locally in Austin, Texas, they're shipping everywhere. They're making this same product into Shishugibon and a bunch of other things. So I'll put a link for those guys, both Kebony and Delta Millworks, my supply house, in the description below. Guys, big thanks to Polywall for sponsoring today's video. If you're not currently a subscriber, hit that subscribe button. We've got new content here in the Build Show every Tuesday and every Friday. Follow me on Twitter or Instagram, otherwise we'll see you next time on the Build Show.